Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. Today we're going to look at our second lecture, Formulating and Clarifying the Research Topic. Let's begin our lecture with an overview of the research process. A research process consists of several steps that are necessary to effectively carry out research. The research process follows a logical sequence, and the steps involved are not mutually exclusive, nor are they separate and distinct from one another. The researcher must be consistently anticipating at each step in the research process the requirements of the subsequent steps. As you can see, we will ideally begin with identifying the problem, followed by reviewing the literature in relation to the problem. Once we have read a significant amount of literature and identified the possible research gaps, we will then set up our research questions, objectives, as well as hypotheses. Then we will prepare our research design and decide on the sampling procedure, if necessary. All this is to make way for data collection and later data analysis. Finally, we will do the write-up, which includes the presentation and interpretation of our findings. But life is not that simple, nor straightforward. While research is often depicted as moving through each stages one after the other, in reality, oftentimes our research process involves a lot of back and forth, making the entire process more complicated than the overview we saw just now. Each step has to be related to the next step, and subsequent steps need to reflect previous steps. Sometimes we do things simultaneously, and oftentimes we need to revisit earlier steps more than once whenever we feel that we have reached a dead end. Each time we revisit a step, we need to reflect on surrounding issues and refine our ideas. In addition, we need to consider ethical issues too during the entire process. Before you begin your research, you need to have at least some idea of what you want to do. In this lecture, we will look at the first step of the research process in more detail. This step includes formulating and clarifying the research problem or topic, which is the starting point of your research. There are generally 4 important aspects that you need to cover within this first step. That is, knowing the attributes of a good research topic, generating and refining ideas that can help you select a suitable topic, turning those ideas into clear problem statement, research questions and objectives, and writing the research proposal. But before that, let's see why this stage is important. Formulation of the problem in a research topic is the first step in ensuring research is relevant. If not done correctly, the remainder of the research process will be useless. Remember, garbage in, garbage out. You must begin with a clear understanding of the reason for undertaking research. You need to focus on a decision because if there's no decision, there will be no research. Ideally, you should not proceed with the research until you have defined your problem. Identification of research problem opens new questions and possibilities. It's an opportunity to test new ideas or reinterpret old problems to form fresh new perspectives. I'd like to share with you several interesting quotes to remind you why having a clear problem identification is important. The first is a quote by Seneca. When a man does not know what he is seeking, no wind is the right one. Next is a quote by Dwight Eisenhower. Plans are nothing. Planning is everything. And finally, there's a conversation between Alice and the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland. Would you tell me please which way I ought to walk from here? That depends a good deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. Oh, I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you walk, said the cat. Now that you know why this step is important, let's take a look at what makes a good research topic. There are 2 important attributes of a good research topic. Your research needs to be feasible and worthwhile. Among the aspects of feasibility is that the topic will sustain your interest and stimulate you to produce good work. However, fascination towards the topic alone isn't enough. You also need to consider whether or not you can complete the research in the amount of time given, and will the findings be current by the time you finish, as well as the availability of data and financial resources. As for being worthwhile, you need to see if your topic meets the standards of your examining institution, in this case IIUM, whether your research topic can be linked to any particular theory, and will you be able to state your research questions and objectives clearly. You also need to ensure that your research topic relates to your field of study or the idea that may be given to you by your supervisor or institution. A good research will be able to provide fresh insights into the topic. Now that you know what constitutes a good research topic, you can proceed with choosing your topic. This step can be one of the most difficult stages in the writing process. Sometimes you won't be able to come up with any ideas, while other times you may have so many ideas that sorting through them may seem impossible. Many techniques are available to assist you in generating and refining ideas for your research. You can use these techniques, but remember to consider your purpose and audience as you refine your topic. You can generate ideas by thinking rationally or creatively. To get ideas by rational thinking, you may try these techniques. 1. You may examine your own strengths and interests. Look at those assignments during your master's or undergraduate that you did well on and received a good grade. You may also examine the faculty members' research interests to see if any of them suit yours. 2. You can try looking at past project titles for ideas. Browse through IIUM's list of past thesis titles for anything that captures your interest. 3. Have discussions with your friends, peers in the field or supervisor, or even practitioners or professionals in the relevant fields. 4. You may also get some ideas by searching the literature, such as articles, reports, and books. When the articles and reports have been obtained, it is often helpful to look for unfounded assertions and statements of the research gap to provide fresh insights. 5. You may also scan the media to know what are the in things that can be researched about. To get ideas by creative thinking, you may try these techniques. 1 is to keep a notebook of ideas, which simply involve you to note down any interesting research ideas as you think of them. You can then pursue the topic in a more rational thinking method later. 2. Try to explore a few projects that you like. For each of these projects, jot down your thoughts like what appeals to you about those projects, or what is good about the project, or why is the project good, etc. 3. Do a relevance tree. You start with a broad concept from which further topics can be generated. Each of these topics form a separate branch from which you can generate further, more detailed sub-branches. As you proceed down the sub-branches, more ideas are generated and recorded. 4. You can also generate ideas by brainstorming. Try to define the ideas or problems that you're interested in as precisely as possible. Then ask for suggestions relating to the problem without being judgmental towards any of them. Review all of the suggestions and explore what they mean. Once your research ideas are generated, you can now refine them by using the following techniques. 1. The Delphi technique. This technique begins with the development of a set of open-ended questions on a specific issue. These questions are then distributed to various experts or ordinary people who are interested in the research idea to generate and choose a more specific idea. The responses to these questions are summarized, and a second set of questions that seek to clarify areas of agreements or disagreements is formulated and distributed to the same group again. 2. Preliminary study. You can also review the existing literature and revisit the techniques and informal discussions with people who have personal experience or knowledge about your research ideas. 3. Integrating ideas. You can then integrate the ideas collected to have a clear direction of your own research and to ensure that your objectives and findings match. And 4. Refine the topics given. Sometimes you may be given topics by your supervisor or your employee. While there's no problem with that, just be sure that you need to weigh the advantage of doing something useful to the organization against the disadvantage of a potential lack of personal motivation on your part. It's important to try and achieve a good balance. Now that we have covered what constitutes a good research topic and how to choose your topic by generating ideas, let's proceed with turning those ideas into clear problem statement, research questions, and objectives. For that purpose, we need to look back at the first step in the research process, which is identifying the problem or problem identification. This step is important not only because it should be reflected in your problem statement, but because it determines the data to be collected, the characteristics of the data which are relevant, the choice of techniques to be used, and the form of the final report. First of all, you need to know that a problem doesn't necessarily mean that something is seriously wrong with the current situation that you need to fix it immediately. A problem could also indicate an interest in an issue where finding the right answers might help to improve an existing situation. Thus, it's more appropriate to define a problem as any situation where a gap exists between an actual and a desired ideal state. In identifying the problem, you need to ask yourself several questions. First, what is the significance of your research? This can be viewed from several perspectives, that is, from your perspective or from society at large. Note that this is different from the significance of the problem. Your problem or topic may be significant, but that does not necessarily mean your research will also be significant. We will look at research significance in the next slide. Second, there's the question of feasibility, which was covered in an earlier slide. Although there are many interesting questions from which answers are of interest or need to be found, sometimes some answers just cannot be found. An example is the question of whether there's life after death. So try to avoid these sort of topics. A third question relates to whether the problem has been extensively covered. Remember, a PhD research requires original contribution to knowledge. So, the more extensive the existing coverage of the research problem, the less likely it is that new knowledge can be uncovered. For the research to be meaningful, it should have some significance. So, what would make our research significant? Well, research can be significant if it has any of the following: theoretical significance, social significance, ethical significance, or personal interest. Let's take a look at them one by one. 1. A research is significant if it could make some contribution to theory, whether to develop new theory or to augment, modify, or disprove existing theory. That will certainly earn you your PhD. For instance, the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem elaborates on the theory of comparative advantage, so your research will have a theoretical significance if your work extends that theory, provide empirical support, or disprove it. 2. A research is significant if the research could have some implications for society. For instance, research on obesity contributes to the health of the community, while research on the impact of disasters on the economy can help in the design of policies to mitigate such impact. 3. A research is significant if the research can contribute to the ethical debate. For instance, research on plagiarism can contribute to the crafting of better safeguards. And 4. A research is significant if it could be of personal interest. But be careful, if this interest does not coincide with the other dimensions of significance, it would not make a strong case for a PhD. For instance, understanding why some people like clashing colors in their clothing may be of interest to you, but not necessarily to anyone else, except maybe clothing manufacturers. Relating to the issue of feasibility is whether or not your problem is researchable. Let's take an example of the relationship between religion and business. Is this a researchable question? Like, how do you measure being religious and able to do business? So, to see whether a problem is researchable, you can ask yourself these questions. 1. Is the research problem large enough? That is the research problem sufficiently comprehensive to warrant the award of a PhD? Or is it too resource-intensive to study in the time frame given and with the resources available? Is there enough depth to warrant analysis of PhD quality? 2. Is the research focused? Because unfocused research leads to confusion as to what the researcher is trying to do and makes it difficult to find a theme. 3. Is the topic of research sufficiently deep to be of PhD quality? It's not about quantity. John Nash's thesis, in which he solved a two-person variable sum games, was just under 30 pages long. It's more about whether there are insights of significance that can be drawn that has not already been drawn. And just as important, unless one is aiming for a purely theoretical research, is there adequate data, both in quantitative and qualitative terms, to empirically support or refute hypotheses? If this question cannot be answered well, the prospect of doing a successful piece of research is not good. So you already know what are the issues to consider in identifying a research problem. Now let's take a look at how to identify a research problem. Ideas for a research problem tend to come from two sources: real life and the scholarly arena. First, identifying a research problem can be as simple as observation and experience. By observing abnormal conditions or complaints and deviations from planned targets, you may encounter ongoing issues on a daily basis. These ongoing obstacles and issues can be the catalyst for developing a research problem. Alternatively, research problems can be identified by deductions from theory or by reviewing recent literature. Often, the section of recommendations for the future studies provided at the end of journal articles or doctoral dissertations suggest potential research problems. In addition, major reports and databases in the field may reveal findings or database facts that call for additional investigation or suggest potential issues to be addressed. Looking at what theories need to be tested is another opportunity to develop a research problem. Ideally, we begin our literature review once we have identified our problem. This is to enable us to know more about the status of knowledge in our research topic and to identify research gaps. Once we have read a significant amount of literature, then only will we set up our research questions, objectives, as well as hypotheses. But for the purpose of this presentation, I will be sharing the process of the latter first. A separate lecture on literature review will be made in the next class. So once you have found your potential research problem, you will need to come up with a problem statement. A problem statement is a concise description of the problem that tells the reader the issue being tackled by the researcher. The problem statement identifies the current state, the desired future state, and any gaps in between. Therefore, it brings clarity to the problem and focuses on what issues have to be resolved. A problem statement is an important communication tool that can help to ensure those who read the thesis to know what the problem is being addressed and why the research is important. A problem statement includes the general objective and research questions. This is because a problem statement would necessarily lead to at least one research question or research objective, which would in turn generate numerous questions and/or hypotheses. You need to be able to clearly answer the questions: what is the problem and why is this problem worth my attention from the problem statement? So what makes a good problem statement? There are plenty of characteristics. For one, a good problem statement has to be clear and specific in that it addresses the gap in knowledge. Besides that, a good problem statement limits the scope of the study to a specific question. A good problem statement is also one that is researchable. That is, the problem should be open to data collection and empirical testing. A good problem statement should also not suggest a solution. Rather, it should lead to further research. Last but not least, a good problem statement can be written in question form or statement form, though according to Kerlinger, a good problem statement should be stated clearly and unambiguously in question form. Here is an example of a problem statement in a business research. Ideally, a problem statement comprises both the research question and objectives. As you can see, the author began with a description of the problem in the first paragraph, followed by a smooth transition towards his or her research objective and questions. Here is another example of a problem statement, but in an economic research. The thesis is on the dynamics of exchange rate pass-through into domestic prices in Malaysia. The author began with a description of a problem and ended with a question, which is consistent to what Kerlinger suggested. And here is another example of a problem statement in a law research. As you can see, the author begins with 2 or 3 sentences to introduce the background of the problem, followed by a statement of the general problem, and including scholarly support and transition to the specific problem. After which, the author states the problem specifically. And it ends with the conclusion of the problem statement with 1 or 2 sentences that addresses the impact or adversity of the specific problem. Now let's move on to research questions. The research questions specify what you want to learn about the topic. They guide and structure the process of collecting and analyzing information to help you to attain the purpose of your study. In other words, research questions are the translation of the problem into a specific need for information. In writing good research questions, it is important that the question is sufficient to generate the sort of research that is consistent with the standards expected of you. A question that prompts a descriptive answer, for example, what is the proportion of graduates entering the public service who attended the top research universities in Malaysia, is far easier to answer than why are graduates from top research universities in Malaysia more likely to enter public service than graduates from other universities. However, beware of research questions that are too easy. But sometimes we are more likely to ask research questions that are too difficult. The question cited just now is an example. Why are graduates from top research universities in Malaysia more likely to enter the public service than graduates from other universities? This is a difficult question because it would be probably very difficult to gain sufficient access to the inner portals of the public service to get a good grasp of staff selection process, which may favor one type of candidate over another. You may use the Goldilocks test to decide if your research questions are either too big, too small, too hot, or just right. Research questions that are too big probably need significant research funding because they demand too many resources. Research questions that are too small are likely to be of insufficient substance, while those that are too hot may be so because of sensitivities that may be aroused as a result of doing the research. The goal is to formulate research questions that are just right. Research questions that are just right are those that are just right for investigation at this time by this researcher in this setting. Another thing that you must avoid is asking research questions that will not generate new insights. This may raise the issue of the extent to which you have done your literature review. It is often a useful starting point in the writing of research questions to begin with one or a general research question that flows from your research idea. You may consult your supervisor or conduct a brainstorming session with your peers or use the Delphi techniques to refine your research questions. Now let's take a look at several examples. Here are examples of research ideas and their research questions. The first topic is crime and unemployment in Malaysia. So the research questions that were derived from this topic are: how does unemployment rate affect the crime rate in Malaysia? And what are the factors that induce Malaysians to commit crime? The second example is Malaysia pegged exchange rate. So the research questions for this topic is: what is the actual value of the ringgit during 1998 to 2005? And what are the impacts of pegged ringgit on the Malaysian economy? Now let's move on to research objectives. The purpose or objective of the research is to explain why the study is being done. The research objectives should be brief, but nonetheless communicate clearly the focus of the research. Research objectives are specific statements of information required to address or answer your research problem. It should be limited to a manageable number, like 2 or 3 objectives. Too many research objectives may cause the study to be too large and thus unfeasible. Your research may begin with a general research question that can generate more detailed research questions, or you may use your general research question as a base to form a set of research objectives. Here are several keywords that you can use to write your research objectives. So here are several examples of research ideas and their research objectives. We use the same topics as before. The first topic, which is crime and unemployment in Malaysia, gives these research objectives. 1. To identify major factors that affect the crime rates in Malaysia. 2. To determine different types of crime by Malaysians. And 3. To examine the causality pattern between crime and unemployment in Malaysia. The second topic, Malaysia pegged exchange rate, gave way to 4 research objectives. 1. To identify the monetary factors that are affecting the ringgit per US dollar. 2. To formulate a model for the exchange rate. 3. To estimate the equilibrium exchange rate for ringgit per US dollars. And 4. To determine whether the exchange rate is over or undervalued after imposing the pegging system. Now let's have an overview of all of the things that we have covered earlier. From the problem statement, we find theories that are most relevant to our research problem and develop the conceptual framework for our research. Remember, our research should always fall within this framework because failure to do so is a common criticism of external examiners. Once we have related our research problem to the relevant body of theory or set the problem within its theoretical framework, we are better able to define specific questions for our research. These questions can come from areas that have been lightly researched, or research gaps, or areas which are argumentative, where prevailing views can be challenged. Out of the questions will come research objectives. These objectives seek to answer the stated research questions. Generally, there should be at least one objective for each question, but there could be several objectives in answering a question. Now let's move on to the next important thing in the first step of the research process, hypotheses. What's a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a specific statement of prediction. It describes what you expect will happen or not happen in your study. A single study may have one or many hypotheses, and each hypothesis can have sub-hypotheses. The setting up of explicit hypotheses is vital to quantitative research, but not so much for qualitative research. This is because a basic objective of quantitative research is to verify hypotheses or to show they are true or untrue. The true spirit of quantitative research is not adhered to if a researcher has no idea what hypothesis he or she once tested when the research begins. Even if they didn't, the literature review would have informed them. A hypothesis provides an answer to a research question. Say we have this research question. Does the proportion of income spent on consumption goods or services depends on the level of income? A hypothesis is that there is no relation between the two. So this answer may be yes or no. That is why all hypotheses in a thesis must be related to a research questions asked. Since a research problem will have multiple research questions, so there will correspondingly be multiple hypotheses. Actually, a hypothesis can be thought of as consisting simultaneously of two hypotheses. When a hypothesis says X is related to Y, then its negation is X is not related to Y. One describes your prediction, and one that describes all the other possible outcomes with respect to the hypothesized relationship. The hypothesis that predicts an outcome is called the null hypothesis, and the hypothesis that describes the remaining possible outcomes is called the alternative hypothesis. Note that for the above to happen, the null and alternative hypotheses must have mutually exclusive outcomes and exhaust the entire range of outcomes. The objective of the research is to choose between them. Let's take a look at several desirable features of hypothesis. A good hypothesis should be the logical conclusion to a logical research question or the answer to a research problem. The problem is the rationale for the hypothesis. It should be able to explain that question supported by well-articulated arguments. A hypothesis should also have good explanatory power. This means if one were to gather data, the data should provide strong support for or for rejection of the hypothesis. Here's an example. Say our conclusion is wealth is respected in society. So our problem is what gives a person high self-esteem in society? So our hypothesis is having wealth does not give a person high self-esteem. Besides that, a desirable feature of a hypothesis is that it must be verifiable or testable. A hypothesis must contain variables that can be observed and measured. This means it must be based on real events, situations, or people. One cannot test a hypothesis involving the argument that, say, China would have grown faster economically had not the communists taken over. That is a counterfactual, not a hypothesis. Testability also implies refutability. A testable hypothesis must permit research results that contradict it, leading to the conclusion that the hypothesis is rejected. For instance, the hypothesis that feng shui can enhance one's wealth can neither be refuted nor validated. This is because it is a claim, not a hypothesis. Another example is belief in miracles. Those who believe in them claim that only believers can experience them. Hence, any hypothesis claiming miracles occur cannot be objectively refuted. Research problems are most often posed by existing knowledge and research. Using this knowledge can also help to identify new research problems that have not been posed. In that sense, the hypothesis links the proposed research to those that have been done in the past. Let's take a look at how to develop hypotheses. Hypotheses can come from several ways. We can pursue the logic of our arguments to arrive at propositions. Propositions that can be verified can then become hypotheses. Or we may see patterns or regularities in the data to suggest certain trends or relationships. These can be hypotheses too. Or there may be hypotheses in the existing literature that the researcher is not convinced about. He can then develop what he believes to be more convincing hypotheses. However they are arrived at, hypotheses arise as a result of a priori thinking about the subject, as well as examination of the available data and materials including related studies. Working hypotheses are more useful when stated in precise and clearly defined terms. Now that you have covered problem identification, what are its implications towards your proposal? Before that, what is a proposal? A proposal is an exercise in persuasion, where you seek to convince your audience that you can complete a meaningful and interesting piece of research on the topic that you have selected. Writing a research proposal is a crucial part of the research process. In the proposal, you outline in detail how you propose to do that. In other words, a proposal describes the research plan. The more thorough and complete the proposal, the clearer and more complete the plan. All of the things that you have learned earlier in this video will be reflected in your research proposal by way of your problem statement, research questions, research objectives, hypotheses, as well as the significance of the problem. Remember, the theoretical framework must first be explained before hypotheses are established. All research in the thesis must reference this framework and research questions. When you have generated ideas for your research and refined them, you can proceed to becoming an active researcher. You need to be organized and track your progress as much as you can. Only then will you be able to see if you are on track or need to go back a few steps.